Hello, good afternoon, everybody. I think we can now start our afternoon session. My name is Sangwoo. I'm the Deputy Minister in charge of Public Diplomacy and also Consular Affairs at the Korean Foreign Ministry. And I'm honored to be today your moderator for this session. The theme for our session is From Competition to Coexistence, Expanding Cooperation in a Fragmented World. Very broad, very important, and I know it sounds now like a cliche now to talk about a tectonic change taking place in the world order. You know, we're finding ourselves navigating a complex global landscape with strategic competition intensifying, you know, geopolitical fragmentation rising, and uncertainty becoming the norm. But against this geopolitical reality, it has become more imperative and more important to find pathways for practical and realistic cooperation. So to help us navigate this new path that we're traveling together, we have a truly distinguished panel with us today. Let me introduce one of them one by one. To my left, we have Ambassador from Singapore, Mr. WONG Jiun. And next we have Ambassador from Poland, Mr. Bartosz WISNIEWSKI. I got it right. And from Australia, we have Minister Counselor, Mr. Martin Walker. And we also have our former ambassador to the United States, Mr. Hoyoung. And last but not least, we have Professor Leif-Eric EASLEY from Ewha University. So to go back to our theme, I guess we could say that as countries implement their own policies and initiatives, such as de-risking and supply chain diversification, this actually inadvertently contributes more to the acceleration of global fragmentation. So the big question that we have today is reviving or resuscitating the international cooperation systems that we are used to in the old world a realistic goal, or are we destined now to live in a fragmented era of purely transactional interactions? In other words, can we revive or reinvent international cooperation to fit in this fragmented world? And can we strike a balance between pursuing our national interests through new initiatives to guard our national interests and also forge a sustainable international cooperation system? So these are very broad questions, a broad theme, but very important and provocative session. So I would like to now open the floor to each participants to make their opening remarks. I would suggest, in the interest of time, to limit your remarks to roughly 8 minutes. So first, our ambassador from Singapore, Mr. WONG Jiun. Thank you.
Chair, Deputy Minister, fellow panelists, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is a privilege to be here in Jeju for this important forum and to discuss this particular topic. I would like to first begin by making some brief comments about the general state of the world in which we find it today. The global consensus that has once brought us peace and prosperity in the region is no longer in its current state. It is fraying. The rules-based international order that has been built over decades is no longer seen as the default framework. Where once there was economic integration, now there is fragmentation. Where once interdependence was seen as an asset, it is now seen as a vulnerability. So some countries are pulling apart at a time when precisely the global challenges require us to pull closer together. And so overall, the geopolitical environment that we find ourselves in today is far more unpredictable and a lot less stable. It is a deeply sobering picture, especially for Singapore. It is an existential issue for us because we are a small city-state with a very open economy. Our prosperity and survival depends on a rules-based, stable system and the free flow of people, of talent, of ideas, of trade, of capital. And as a small country, we lack the strategic heft of a big country that will allow us to buffer ourselves from turbulence. And faced with this fragmentation that is in the world, Singapore's response has been to continue to steadfastly hold on to the principles of rules-based multilateralism and to other principles like the peaceful resolution of disputes. We continue to press ahead with greater regional economic integration. And our firm belief is that the pressing global challenges that we face today, ranging from climate change to AI governance to pandemic preparedness to supply chain resilience, all of this requires more cooperation and not less. Thankfully, Singapore, despite our small size, we are not without agency, and we are also not alone, because there are many other countries in the world which share our concerns about the fragmentation in the world, and which also shares the same kind of commitment to an open rules-based system. Having said this backdrop, I would like to just make 3 points about cooperation in this fragmented world. The points may sound very obvious, but I think some obvious points do need to be restated. So my first point is that we have to double down on our existing bilateral relations and make them stronger. And this is to make them more dynamic and relevant in the current circumstances we find ourselves in. And that means that we continue to engage each other and deepen cooperation in areas that will affect our shared future, in both traditional areas like trade and investment, but also in emerging areas like AI, digital economy, and sustainability. As the ambassador of Singapore here in Korea, it would be remiss of me not to talk about Singapore-Korea relations. So allow me to speak a little bit about that. Singapore and the ROK are excellent partners. We share a common outlook on the essential principles of free trade, international law, and the rules-based multilateral order. Just last year, our two countries upgraded relations to a strategic partnership, and it not only reflects the strength of our partnership, but also a shared recognition that only by working together, we'll be better able to navigate the challenges in our uncertain, fragmenting global environment. My second point is, beyond strengthening the bilateral relationships, we must also advance regional cooperation. In a fragmented world, regional integration and collaboration all the more matter. Regional institutions and frameworks, even when they are imperfect, remain useful tools that smaller countries can use to give them a louder collective voice, a stronger collective leverage, so that they can better advance their collective interest in a world that is dominated by the major powers. They also help to foster good behavior in the international community. Within Southeast Asia, we have this grouping known as ASEAN, the Association for Southeast Asian Nations. For close to 60 years, ASEAN has provided an important platform through which the ASEAN member states constructively engage each other and also the other major powers and partners in the world. We have sought to create an open and inclusive regional architecture, and through forums such as the East Asia Summit, we have brought all the key stakeholders to our region, including the ROK, to the same table. In doing so, we have given our external partners a stake in the peace, prosperity, and stability of our region. And when these external partners come into our region, ASEAN member states also benefit because we're given options, we're given room for maneuver. Regional integration also brings about economic heft and trade opportunities. And again, speaking of ASEAN, our 11 states as a bloc form the world's 5th largest economy right now, and we're on track to become the world's 4th largest by 2030. ASEAN's economic integration has come a long way, and it's still an ongoing process. Negotiations to upgrade the ASEAN-Korea FTA just started this year. We have also successfully concluded negotiations on the ASEAN Digital Economic Framework Agreement, which will create a digitally connected Southeast Asia through streamlined, robust, and shared digital rules. We're also working on an ASEAN power grid that will facilitate cross-border electricity trade. When Singapore takes over as ASEAN chairmanship in 2027, so next year, a year that coincides with ASEAN's 60th anniversary, we will continue to make efforts to ensure that regional integration remains a key focus and that ASEAN remains a vital anchor for peace, stability, and prosperity in Asia. My third point is that we have to be creative and pragmatic about the way that we advance multilateral cooperation. As our world fragments and evolves, what used to work in the past may not work as well today. Rather than be stuck in the old way of doing things, we have to be creative, think out of the box, reform and improve existing systems, and test out new ideas. smaller groups of countries can get together to lay the foundations for a refreshed system through plurilateral arrangements or agreements, which complements the existing systems in the world. This can serve as a building block for future cooperation going forward, and it is described by my Prime Minister as flexible multilateralism. In this way, cooperation can be reconfigured around a few countries in a pragmatic and flexible way, linking them up in different regions so that they can work on specific issues and advance common objectives. In the time I've left, maybe I'll just highlight this particular example known as the Future of Investment and Trade Partnership, or FIT-P, FIT partnership. It was launched last September as a grouping of 16 like-minded small to medium-sized economies around the world, advocating for free, open, rules-based, and fair trade. It complements the existing arrangements, including the WTO, and serves as an incubator to bring fresh concepts into global conversations and develop solutions that are practical, inclusive, and responsive to the needs of businesses and customers in this modern world. So just summing up, I think individually, small and medium powers may have limited leverage, but working together bilaterally and also regionally with clarity of purpose, with consistency of principle, and with a good dose of creativity and resourcefulness, we can exercise and amplify our collective agency in a fragmented world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Really, especially your point on the role that the small and medium-sized nations can play through other organizations such as here for Singapore ASEAN. I think it's something that we could further delve into, and something that I would like to ask further as we progress in this session. Next, we'll have Ambassador WISNIEWSKI from Poland. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Minister. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much to Ministry of Foreign Affairs for inviting me to speak on this panel and to be able to share some thoughts on the cooperation in fragmented world. By your permission, I will center my opening remarks around answers to two general questions. The first one: where is the balance between safeguarding each country's own national interests, especially in economic sphere, and preserving sustainable international cooperation and coexistence? That's question number one. And secondly, what are the practical ways for countries that are like-minded to align with one another for mitigating tensions and revitalizing multilateral cooperative system? So the first question is actually quite philosophical, I have to say. But I will give you a philosophical answer. The balance lies in the eye of the balancer. It's going to be different for each and every sovereign country that there is in the systems. And as long as there are sovereign states, this is how the world system is going to be organized. Every nation state, Poland, Singapore, Australia, Korea, every country is going to strike this balance according to different criteria, according to their assets, vulnerabilities, fears, skills of their leaders. I could go on and on and on and on. The list of factors, in fact, infinite. And so is the calculation of every state when it approaches international cooperation. Do I have an upper hand vis-a-vis other states, or should I rather gang together with others to create these favorable conditions? There are some issues in any countries or group of countries calculations that are perhaps sometimes non-negotiable. What could they be? As you know, Poland is a member of the European Union. A lot of what we do on the international stage is actually channeled through the European Union. The European Union is a multiplier of our international influence. And as such, the EU, of course, has certain powers that the member states decided to maybe not outsource, but to pool with European institutions. One of them is trade negotiations. And among those trade negotiations, of course, the EU enters in a lot of FTAs, including with the Republic of Korea. Most recently with India, with countries from South America, Mercosur. And I was recently in a conversation with a fellow ambassador. And I got a question. Why was the EU so insistent on sticking to agricultural standards so strictly? And my answer was it's not because of agriculture. It's because of the safety and comfort of European consumers. There are some issues that are non-negotiable. And every country that is represented in this panel, but in this conference, would probably find these red lines that make negotiation maybe not impossible, but certainly create a certain red line. Therefore, in general, I would argue that states are protective when they must, and cooperative when they can. This is hardly reinventing the wheel, right? But the balance is never static, it's dynamic. This is very important to understand. This creates, of course, uncertainty, because we can never be sure where the balance lies. If we're negotiating with Singapore, we have to ask ourselves a question, where is the balance? If we're negotiating with Australia, the same. Because no single state or group of states can ever be entirely sure what is driving the calculations of the other side, be it neighbors or countries that are geographically quite distant. Of course, there is a way to limit or at least manage uncertainty, and it's called diplomacy. And this is where actually we become relevant, we as diplomats and bureaucrats. It can help us push the limit of what is acceptable by bargaining and negotiation. As long as we know what is important for you, you will know what is important for us, maybe we can strike a middle ground. Well, but it can also signal to the other side what are the red lines that I just mentioned, which should not be crossed without creating unnecessary tension. So sometimes it's better not to raise an issue rather than encounter lack of willingness for dialogue. Now, when it comes to like-minded countries, I think that it's not us as like-minded, because, by the way, Singapore and Australia, the EU, Poland in particular, we're all like-minded countries. But I have a feeling that in today's world, it is not differences between us that really are driving the processes. During the Cold War, some of you might remember that there were institutions in place to strictly monitor and limit cooperation between the blocs. One such area was, for example, technology transfer, right? The West realized at a certain point that the Soviet economy is so backward that they could actually starve the Soviets to death. And they put in place very strict, very effective ways to limit technology transfer. This changed, of course, after the collapse of the bipolar system and when the organizing principle of international relations became globalization. Right? And not just globalization, but also free trade, open markets, and so on and so forth. And here we are in 2026, after more than 3 decades of tearing down trade barriers, of expanding, using the FTAs, globalizing the supply chains. Here we are in a situation where supply chains actually became ideologically neutral. We don't care whether the country is like-minded or not like-minded. This was the case, but this is changing, as my distinguished Singaporean colleague has just mentioned. So what worked so far is no longer the case. What used to be our asset, our exposure to the outside world, is becoming our vulnerability. We learned it the hard way during COVID. We're learning it the hard way whenever there is a crisis in a region that is in normal times or in peaceful times considered to be periphery, but all of a sudden it becomes elevated to the center stage. And that, I think, creates another layer of uncertainty, but my time is slowly running out, so I will leave the rest for the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Very philosophical, but at the same time, very practical and diplomatic answer. Next, we have Minister Walker from Australia. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Deputy Minister, and thank you also to MOFA for the kind invitation to this panel and for allowing someone who's not an ambassador to actually participate in an ambassador's panel. But look, it's been a fascinating 3 days for me here in Jeju. It's a bit hard to think of what meaningfully more I can add to the kind of wisdom that's already been shared on this topic of cooperation in a fragmented world. But we all come to this issue with our own personal perspectives and experiences, right? Before serving here, I've been here in Seoul for 2.5 years now. Before that, I was in Tokyo. I have, personal family connections with Japan, but I've become very fond of, even passionate about Korea as well and about this relationship. I've also served in what we now call the Global South, right, in Pretoria in South Africa. But I've also been in Vienna, working as IAEA kind of liaison officer in the Australian mission to the UN in Vienna, and I've spent many, many years working on nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament issues too. So what really makes me excited as a diplomat is working not only with close partners. I'm not going to say like-minded. I always say to my younger colleagues, like-minded with respect to what exactly? So be careful about that term, but close partners. But what really excites me is working with close partners within frameworks and multilateral organizations and so on. So maybe, you might hear some of this disposition coming through in what I'm going to say today. But I think this session really captures one of the defining challenges of our time, cooperation and competition. For a country like Australia, very deeply connected to regional and global markets like Singapore, cooperation amid competition isn't just some kind of abstract diplomatic ideal. It's a practical necessity. So our economy obviously depends on an open international environment, open to trade and investment, stable supply chains. Our security depends on a kind of environment where disputes are settled peacefully and don't spiral into conflicts, where a combination of deterrence and diplomatic reassurance helps keep conflict at bay. So the question is, for us, not whether competition exists. It does, obviously, and it's a normal condition of international relations. The question is how we manage that competition in a way that preserves space for cooperation. And I think let me share with you what I hope is a useful analogy or a metaphor when we think about the current international environment. And that's to imagine a river flowing downhill, where the flow of the river is heavily influenced by the decisions of the major powers and by underlying secular trends and just facts on the ground. I mean, none of us can just simply wish away the facts of geography, of demographics, of economics, or the decisions of the world's biggest countries. Those are the forces that shape the flow of the river. For smaller and middle powers, the question is how we respond to that. We've got different options. So one option is to be like a piece of driftwood, right? You float with the current, you try to avoid the rocks, and you just hope that you won't be swept into dangerous waters. I mean, that may be an understandable response, but it doesn't give you much control over your destiny. A second option is to build a raft, right, with strong buffers and credible kind of self-defense mechanisms and maybe a reliable filtration system. In statecraft terms, that means investing in national resilience, right? So a strong economy, trusted partnerships, stable supply chains, technological and military capability. And certainly a well-built raft can't stop the current, but it can withstand it much better than a piece of driftwood. But there's a third option, and that's to connect our rafts with other rafts in the theory of safety in numbers. Countries that cooperate can obviously gain stability and strength that none of us could achieve alone. But cooperation isn't an end in itself. The objective isn't to create the largest flotilla, and in fact, tying yourself too tightly to certain rafts can make you more vulnerable. But the objective is to build the right connections for the right purposes while making sure each raft can still steer its own course. And I think effective cooperation should be practical, purposeful, and focused on solving real problems. We see that in Australia's regional partnerships, for example. In the Pacific, helping our neighbours build climate-resilient infrastructure. Through the Quad, working with India, Japan, and the US to connect Pacific Island countries to undersea cable networks and to share real-time maritime information that helps them combat illegal fishing. And then through our defence partnerships with countries like Korea, really strengthening collective capability, interoperability and deterrence to help reduce the risk of conflicts. And in fact, according to a recent study, Australia's regional defence and security networks are second only to those of the United States. We're one of the only countries, developed countries, that's not cutting our development assistance budget. In fact, we've just increased it in last month's government budget. 3/4 of that ODA is directed to the Indo-Pacific region, because 22 out of our 26 closest neighbours are developing countries, and we know that if our neighbours can withstand shocks better, then that helps reduce risks before they reach our own shores. But there's a fourth option as well, to come back to my river analogy. Countries that are navigating in turbulent waters can obviously build their own raft, and they can connect their raft to other vessels. But we can also actually gather together at key points in the river to build structures that influence the flow of the water. So smaller and middle powers can't reverse the flow of the river, but they can create channels, reinforce banks, reduce turbulence, and shape how the water actually flows. And that's what international institutions, rules, norms, and agreements, and different cooperative partnerships of all kinds can do. They don't eliminate competition, but they can help make it more manageable, predictable, and hopefully less dangerous. I think a good example of this is the awkwardly named Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP. Often described as a trade agreement, but actually it's an example of countries working together to build a structure that shapes the environment in which kind of competition takes place. When the United States withdrew from the original TPP, many countries thought that the project would collapse, but actually what happened was that a group of regional and middle powers chose to preserve it because they shared an interest in an open, rules-based trading environment. And in our river analogy, the CPTPP isn't just a group of ships tied together, it's actually a channel built into the river itself. It covers 15% of global trade, depending on how you calculate it. So this is one of the most important contributions that middle powers can make, I think. We can't determine the flow of the river, but we can shape how the current flows. Apologies for belaboring the analogy, but I think this is where middle powers really matter. As rules and norms and institutions come under pressure, the space for us to shape outcomes can really narrow. A world organized according to power advantages those with the greatest power. It's axiomatic to say that. But for countries like Australia, these rules and institutions aren't just abstract ideals, they're practical instruments for us that help us pursue our interests, make choices, and influence outcomes. We're sometimes described as middle powers as kind of architects of the international order, but I think another analogy is that we're artisans. Right? Architects may draw the grand design, but it's artisans who build, maintain, and repair the structures. We can work with the materials available, solve practical problems, reinforce what is under strain, and repair what has been broken or damaged. And over time, I think our collective efforts can have a profound impact on the durability and strength of the system. But let me just finish with this one observation. Moderator, look, I just want to say something about networks. Some of you may have heard of the Australian think tank, the Lowy Institute. It publishes what is called the Lowy Institute Asia Power Index, which makes an important point that power is not just measured by tangible resources alone, like economic size or military strength. It's also measured by how effectively countries use those resources through economic and diplomatic and defense networks. And last year's Asia Power Index found that 3 of the countries represented on this panel, Australia, Singapore, and Korea, together with Japan, were the region's biggest overperformers. And what does that mean? It means we exert influence that is far in excess of what our size and our tangible resources alone would suggest. We're highly networked, outward-looking countries that use partnerships and connectivity for strategic weight. And I think the lesson for us and for other middle powers is that influence doesn't just come from resources or size, it comes from the ability to connect and convene and contribute. So in this very, very connected world and contested world, I think power will belong not only to those who have the greatest weight, but also to those with the strongest networks and the ability to turn cooperation into practical outcomes. I'm sorry for going slightly over time, Moderator, but let me leave it there for now.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. That was really visual imaginary. I could actually see us connecting those rafts inside the river. Thank you so much. Next, we have Ambassador Hoyoung. The floor is yours.
Can you hear me? Well, this is the 3rd day of Jeju Forum, and then for 3 days, I think if there is one issue we have been talking again and again and again, there is collapse of rule-based international order, and rule of law making its way to rule of power, and the kind of all those messy situations we are creating for international security as well as international economy. So all of these discussions come down to this, which is that what are we supposed to do? How to deal with all those problems? And of course, all the three, panelists, they have already shared their views. But in my view, I think there are three important issues to keep in mind. The first one is, I think we should be trying to build national consensus on two important goals that we must pursue in this age. One goal would be further strengthening our capability in technology, in economy, in military capability. So that's something we must, in fact, think about in the sense that when the rules do not provide the kind of buffer that we used to depend upon, then, of course, I think the obvious answer would be we must, in fact, have further strength, self-reliance in technology, in economy, in military capability. That's for sure. That's the one national goal that we must pursue. But there must be a second goal, which is all the three previous panelists, they discussed about the importance of cooperation, right? So this, in fact, could be ironic in the sense that when things are becoming very difficult in the international environment, still we don't need less cooperation, but more cooperation. And how do we cooperate? I think, Mr. Walker used a very interesting, analogy, which is, we often talk about architects, but we may need more artisans. But whether we call it architects or artisans, I think what we need is further strengthening existing institutions we have, but at the same time building upon that. And I think for Korea's security, for Korea's economy, then of course we have been building several different layers of cooperation, and I think we should, in fact, be further building and strengthening those layers to further strengthen cooperation. So that's one area that we must focus upon. That is to say, self-reliance and more cooperation. And second thing that I think we must look at would be to review and refine our relationship with important neighbors. And then, of course, the first country we should be thinking about would be the United States. And with United States, I think it is becoming very interesting in the sense that United States, in fact, has been the architect of rule-based international order. But now suggesting we are no longer interested in playing the leadership role for keeping rule-based international order. And, but still, in Korea, the opinion poll goes 80% of Koreans support the alliance between Korea and the United States. I think instinctively Korean citizens understand, even if the international system is becoming very messy, then even then, strengthening bilateral relationship with the United States is very important. So in large number of countries, they talk about, something called Plan B, but what I think is that we need Plan A. We must stick to Plan A and build upon the Plan A. So I talked about, technology, economy, and military capability, and for that, of course, we need self-reliance. And then I talked about, several different layers of cooperation. Of course, we need several different layers. But one of the layers must be bilateral relationship between Korea and then the United States. And then if I say that, then many people ask me, what about China? And I think the answer is obvious in the sense that China, of course, is a very important geopolitical as well as geoeconomic neighbor, and we must try to further strengthen relationship with China as well. But at the same time, it must be based upon certain common understanding. And that common understanding would be the law, importance of law. And again, for 3 days, we have been talking a lot about middle powers. And for middle powers, I think we need to further strengthen rule of law, even if it is being challenged. Just one example between Korea and China, let us think about something called PMZ. That's Provisional Maritime Zone. So back in 2000, we entered into fisheries agreement between Korea and China. And Yellow Sea, the West Sea, is not a huge sea. So our exclusive economic zone, EEZ, overlap with each other. So in those areas where our EEZs overlap, then between Korea and China, we agreed to set up something called PMZ, Provisional Military Maritime Zone. And we agreed in that area, in PMZ, neither of our countries are going to do nothing other than fishing. But what is happening now? The Chinese, they are building artificial structures. That's something we already observed in South China Sea, right? So what can he do? What could Korea do with respect to China when it comes to all those artificial structures in PMZ? I think we must depend upon the law. And then when I talk about upon the law, then of course there is law of the sea, and then there is fishery agreement between Korea and China. So I, in fact, think we must further strengthen relations with China, but we must let the Chinese understand we will do it, but on the basis of rule of law. And then the third, say, neighbor that we should be thinking about would be North Korea. And then North Korea, in fact, began to supply all those ammunitions, artillery, soldiers, etc., etc. And then after that, there has been a large number of assessments coming out in the sense that North Korea, in fact, is enjoying far more, say, elevated status with respect to military capability, with respect to foreign policy capability, with respect to economy, etc., etc. Personally, I think it's much exaggerated. And that exaggeration, in fact, is unfortunately leading to discussions in Washington, D.C., for example, that maybe denuclearization of North Korea is not going to happen. Maybe we should be shifting gear into arms control. That, in fact, is something which will bring far more instability and far more insecurity to the Korean Peninsula. So that, in fact, must be avoided, but at the same time, it must be avoided on, say, more precise understanding of what is happening in North Korea. So let us think about North Korean economy. Well, they say North Korean economy is getting better, but let me just share with you one example, which is that exchange rate of North Korean currency, it depreciated 5 times in the past 2 years. Just think about it. Korean currency, in fact, depreciated from 1,400 to 1,500, right? And it is causing all these difficulties in our financial market. Then just think about it. When North Korean currency depreciated 5 times in 2 years' time, what would have it brought to the North Korean economy? So that, in fact, is a reality. And these are the kind of things, first, I discussed about the importance of 2 national goals, self-reliance and further strengthening of cooperation. And second goal, second thing we must be doing, which is further review and then refine our relationship with our neighbors. I cannot go on with this list of, reviewing with Singapore, Poland, Australia, United States. With United States, of course, I have something to say, but I realize I ran out of my time. So let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you for your invaluable insights on Korea-U.S. alliance, managing our relationship with China, and also, of course, dealing with the North Korean problem. Last but not the least, we have our Professor Leif-Eric from Ewha Women's University. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the organizers of this impressive Jeju Forum. It's an honor to join all of you in conversation and my distinguished colleagues on stage. As the academic on the panel, I could now provide the most theoretical sets of answers, or as the non-diplomat on the panel, maybe I could be the least diplomatic. And since all of you made the sacrifice of being here and are not at the beach during the last session of the Jeju Forum, I think I'm going to go with the second option. So these views represent only my opinion because I'm only speaking for myself. I'd like to speak to South Korean foreign policy in particular and say very frankly that South Korean foreign policy has something to learn from all the other countries represented on this stage. Specifically, and please write these down, Australia's defense cooperation agreements, Poland's military assistance in defense of the international order, and Singapore's role in building regional institutional mechanisms. We need more of all of this. And as the American on stage, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention how all the like-minded partners on this stage are empowered by their close partnerships and alliances with the United States. Now, those relationships naturally involve debates about reliance and autonomy, burden sharing and agency, economic and security benefits, and increasingly, political risk management. But notice, I didn't say that these countries are hedgers or balancers between the US and China. I don't think they are in the strictest sense or definitions of hedging and balancing. These countries are rules-based order defenders, institution builders, and norm entrepreneurs. We're in a period just now of increasing uncertainty where US leadership is not absent, but it's not that much into order, institutions, and norms. But I believe this is temporary. Of course, not everything will go back to the way it once was, the post-Cold War, the Cold War, those eras are over. But like-mindeds are strategically bound to the United States. They've made a choice. I really liked how you said it's not about making a plan B, it's about building on plan A. So in the meantime, I think it's really important that middle powers, quote unquote, hold it together. Not as a favor or service to a delinquent superpower, but in defense of their own interests. We heard that consistently down the line, that openness, rules, networks, and connections are in the interests of the countries represented on this stage. Middle powers have agency. They don't just react passively. They're not just being defensive desperately in their defense of their own interests. I would submit to you that middle powers are actually glue for the international order. They can act as incubators of diplomatic ideas. In other words, they can be influencers of larger powers. And here's the good news. You don't have to deter North Korea alone. You don't have to stand up to China alone. You don't have to hold Russia accountable alone. You don't have to deal with Washington alone. So the whole point of my remarks are that the urgency of now is that like-minded states deepen cooperation with each other. And here, I'm not going to be very diplomatic. I'm going to say this very frankly. I think South Korea, I think the ROK's strengths and potential in these areas are underrated. When compared with the global citizens, the good global citizens of Australia, Poland, and Singapore, South Korea has manufacturing capacity on another scale, including relevant to AI supply chains and defense industry exports. It has a strikingly successful development and democracy story that resonates in the global South, and cultural power projection beyond any other country its size. So, Seoul should do more. But let me first say something about maybe what it shouldn't do. And it's World Cup season. So I'll put it this way. Avoid own goals. Don't mess up OPCON transfer for the reasons of politics and rushing a win for autonomy. Don't politicize the United Nations command. And if you're going for nuclear power submarines, that process and that eventual outcome, and it would be very eventual, should strengthen the alliance with the United States, not weaken it. Don't overemphasize sovereign AI at the expense of being a strategic actor that South Korean firms and the nation is now in the supply chain and ecosystem of the most advanced models and solutions. Don't treat arms exports as if they're just revenue opportunities when they are actually strategic decisions and geopolitical relationships. While continuing to be pragmatic about China and North Korea, I think it's possible to perhaps stand up a bit more to norm violations by Beijing, as was mentioned by some of my colleagues, and in cooperating with like-minded partners in Southeast Asia, the Pacific, Europe, and the Middle East. And finally, with no disrespect to the countries represented on this stage, I think the most important partner for the ROK besides the United States is not represented on this stage. It's Japan. So let me conclude by saying what I think South Korea can do more about with Japan on the dimensions that I've mentioned. I think it would be incredibly productive if South Korea and Japan finally conclude an acquisition and cross-servicing agreement, AXA. This would make cooperation much less bureaucratic, much more smooth in having more frequent exercises, doing contingency planning, and increasing the bilateral defense cooperation, and also trilateral with the United States and other partners. I think more can be done on export control harmonization and implementation. And I think, and I know this is controversial, but I think that South Korea and Japan can do more with third countries when it comes to development cooperation. COICA and JICA can be in the lead on important projects in third countries and partnering with in-country firms and government organizations. And watch this space, because Japan is making some very increasingly important changes to its own defense export policies. And I think this is an area where South Korea and Japan can coordinate more. Defense procurement and cooperation with third countries in increasing their own defense capabilities looking to the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. If I can actually take off my moderator hat and put on a temporary participant hat, I just make a comment on what you just said. I really, that's something that really has been on my mind for quite a long time. Korea's role in the world, what can we do? And for the longest time, we've been bogged down with our own problems here on the Korean Peninsula, here in our neighborhood. And to find solutions here is not viable anymore. We have to look beyond the Korean Peninsula. And given all the changes and all the geopolitical, geoeconomic challenges that we're talking about, I think this is really the right time to go beyond the Korean Peninsula and act more proactively, just like our three countries here are doing. Anyways, okay, I'll put on my moderator hat again. Thank you. Okay, now I think we'll move on to the next section of our session, which is I'll be asking each individual panelist one question, and then after that we'll open the floor to our audience. First, let me just ask my question to our Singaporean colleague, Mr. Ambassador. So my question would be on ASEAN centrality. So how does Singapore envision the future of ASEAN centrality? And how does Singapore define the diplomatic principles and the prudence to protect the ASEAN framework from the influence of these external hegemonic competition and all these challenges that we've been talking about?
Deputy Minister, thank you for that question. I think for ASEAN itself, we've always spoken about ASEAN centrality. It is core to our survival, it is core to our success. And therefore, you will find that in terms of the efforts we've put into developing the regional architecture, ASEAN has always been at the center. So we have the 10 and now 11 ASEAN member states in the center. We have the ASEAN plus 3, which includes the ROK, China, and Japan. We have the East Asia Summit, we have the ASEAN Regional Forum, we have the ADMM Plus, and so on. So all of these are overlapping circles, concentric circles, with ASEAN at the core. And as I mentioned earlier, by being at the center, we allow ourselves to be a convening space for partners outside the region to come in. And when these partners have a stake in our success, it helps us as member states ourselves. And that gives us more options, that gives us more space to move around. And therefore, for the foreseeable future, I would say that because ASEAN member states themselves individually recognize the importance of centrality, it is something we'll hold on to very jealously, but not let go. But ASEAN centrality cannot just be a slogan. So we have to put that into action, put that into actual institutions and mechanisms. The different forums I've listed just now, ASEAN Plus 3, EAS, ARF, and so on, these are examples of actual tangible manifestation of ASEAN centrality. We know that our dialogue partners also speak about this, and we would want to hope that beyond just saying it as a form of lip service, that they themselves, through their actual actions, demonstrate ASEAN centrality in the things that they do. And I think that would be the best, in the best interest of the countries in ASEAN. Thank you.
Now, I have a question for our ambassador from Poland, Mr. WISNIEWSKI. I'm getting your name every time I'm saying it, I'm getting your name right. And our question is, it relates to Poland's security situation. You know, Poland stands at the forefront of NATO's eastern flank amidst the war in Ukraine, and it has emerged as a pivotal security actor with a fast-growing defense capabilities in Europe and so forth. So, given the geopolitical environment currently facing the international community, based on Poland's experience, what would be the most critical lesson that middle powers must draw to safeguard freedom and peace?
That's an easy question, of course. 4 minutes, no problem. Deputy Minister, I think, ladies and gentlemen, I think the answer is twofold. First, let me borrow a quote, which keeps inspiring me. I have to be honest, since I first saw it some 25 years ago in Washington, D.C. And that is that freedom isn't free. And you know this quote? It's from the Korea Veterans War Memorial in Washington, D.C. And it strikes right into the heart of very tough decisions that the Polish government is making, alongside with the Polish society. It's ultimately the taxpayers who are shouldering the burden of 5% of GDP expenditure on defense. What do you do? What do you have to do to spend 5% of GDP on defense? You need political leadership. You need someone to explain to your voters, to your society, that this is important. But it goes beyond that. In 2022, when Russia launched a full-scale invasion against Ukraine, countries in Europe were not aligned when it comes to providing Ukraine with vital economic, but also, crucially, military help. So Poland, at the very beginning, was at the forefront. I don't know how many of you remember of the so-called Tank Coalition. Okay. The Tank Coalition was all about making sure that the Ukrainian army has armor to fight against overwhelming Russian force. A lot of this armor came from Poland. Why? Because we had stocks of Soviet-era equipment that our Ukrainian friends could actually use. And alongside these Soviet-era systems came more modern systems. So it took leadership, because at that time in Europe, there was opposition to moving so-called lethal equipment to Ukrainians. Okay? It took a lot of political courage to actually buck the trend. Second lesson is that if you are counting on your allies, and we are very fortunate to have allies in NATO, if you're counting on your allies' help, you first have to help yourself. Ambassador An mentioned that about self-reliance, self-help. Self-help is a term, Professor EASLEY, correct me if I'm wrong, straight from the Manual of International Relations. Self-help, this is what international relations remains to be based on. NATO treaty consists of 10 articles. Article 5 is arguably the most famous, the most referred to, one for all for one. But before Article 5 comes Article 4, which is about consultations, and even before Article 4 comes Article 3, which says that every ally is obligated to cater for his own defense. So it is up to allies and the allied parties that are forming this alliance to fend for themselves and to ensure that they have capable military forces. So we didn't, of course, invent it. It's enough just to read the treaty, but we put this into action. So this is lesson number 2. What it brought, and we could argue which factor was more important: constant pressure, justified pressure, I should say, from Washington, D.C. to increase military spending. And we did this long before it became so quote-unquote popular, right? It was long before the Hague Summit. It was long before the Wales Summit of 2014. Who is old enough to remember Wales Summit of 2014? I am. So we were spending 2% of GDP long before it became a rule, and now we're spending 5%. What it brought, my time is up, I'm sorry, is the so-called defense awakening in Europe. What we're seeing right now, and Korea is actually profiting from this, we're seeing a defense awakening all across Europe right now. And we understood belatedly that the peace dividend from which we profited for many, many years is over. Some of the countries in Europe realized this earlier, some of them realized this later, but now it seems that nobody finally is questioning it. So these are 2 lessons, I would say. Thank you, and I'm sorry for extending the time.
Thank you very much. Now, moving on to Australia, Mr. Walker. So Australia has been consistently pursuing a range of multilateral cooperations. You're one of the champions of multilateral cooperations with very, creating very creative configurations, including the AUKUS, obviously, Quad, the IP4. So how does Australia assess the value of these multilateral cooperation, and how could such cooperation contribute to stability and prosperity in the region?
Thanks, Deputy Minister Jiun. Look, I think, yes, Australia probably looks like a bit of a minilateral entrepreneur, and we seem to be the common denominator in many of these partnerships that you see flourishing across the region, but not just this region, even connecting different regions, and I'll come to that. I used to work in the part of the Australian Foreign Ministry, the kind of strategic policy bureau that had an overview of these different partnerships. It was very interesting kind of work to do. But the reality is actually, and I know my Korean friends share this problem, a lot of the time you have different bureaus of the foreign ministry responsible for different minilaterals, and no one's kind of actually pulling them all together and asking the big questions about, like, what does this forum add to what we already have? But look, the reality is that the landscape has become so complex now that a lot of problems can't be solved through traditional frameworks, traditional multilateral frameworks, or through bilateral partnerships. And sometimes it's just the reality that a smaller group of countries with shared interests and capabilities can actually work together to more quickly, effectively get things done. There's maybe a false dichotomy between kind of strategic dialogue and practical delivery, right? Australians have a reflex to say, like, enough talking, what are we actually going to do together? And I think the minilateral partnerships need to work out what they actually exist to do. But sometimes they can do both. So the Quad, for example, is a very practically focused diplomatic partnership focused on kind of maritime domain awareness, infrastructure, health security. It's got common interests, but also complementary capabilities. Taking the Quad vaccine partnership during the COVID period as an example, US vaccine technology, Indian vaccine production capability. You know, Australia's and Japan's health networks throughout Southeast Asia and the Pacific actually got the job done. AUKUS, very, very differently, it's obviously focused on strengthening advanced defence capabilities between the three countries, not an alliance, but a defence technology sharing partnership. And then the IP4 grouping of Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and Korea really provides a practical way, I think, for us to channel our common interests in the way that we engage with NATO because of the connected security between the Indo-Pacific and Europe. Look, I think, and I spent a lot of time in Canberra working on that connection between the shared strategic interests between Europe and our region. And a great example of this coming to life in the form of a minilateral partnership was pioneered by Singapore, which announced at the Shangri-La Dialogue just this year a new 17-country partnership spanning Europe and Southeast Asia to share information on threats to undersea cable networks. I mean, you know, in November 2024, we had some absolutely egregious cases of severing of undersea cables in the Baltic Sea, leading to the standing up of Operation Baltic Sentry. So what can we learn in Asia from that experience as Taiwan starts to notice more and more threats to and attacks to kind of undersea cable infrastructure around Taiwan? So that's, you know, Singapore is doing this, Australia, a range of other countries getting together in different formats for different purposes. But I think the main point is, you know, minilateral cooperation works best when it complements rather than kind of replaces inclusive regional institutions. The Quad has been for a long time now kind of trying to set up a more permanent kind of sort of structured dialogue with ASEAN. There's been a bit of neuralgia and nervousness in ASEAN about that, but I think we're over that hump now. ASEAN is prepared to have a conversation with the Quad through what I think we're going to call ASEAN +4, rather than ASEAN. Like, what? Okay, the nomenclature doesn't matter. The important thing is the dialogue itself. So yeah, it's an exciting area. I think there's a lot of opportunity for Korea to engage here. And it's a big part of the bilateral discussions that we have with Seoul. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, I forgot to mention we have a unilateral with Australia and the United States too. Korea, Australia, and the U.S. And I actually was working on that configuration 5-6 years ago when I was working at the headquarters. Anyways, so moving on. Now, Ambassador An, you talked about not Plan B, but building upon Plan A. So with that in mind, what should be Korea's vision for the future of Korea-U.S. alliance as we adapt to these emerging challenges and as we adapt to this new emerging international order?
Well, yesterday, there was a session among, say, former foreign ministers, and there was one former minister who said, well, we talk about the collapse of rule-based international order, and we say as if it's a huge challenge for the international community, but at the same time, it is return to the normalcy. Well, international relations basically has been rural power. And then, as a matter of fact, the 40 to 80 years that we have gone through for the past 80 years, that was exceptional. Before that, thousands of years, in fact, international politics meant power politics. So it is returning to normalcy. So we shouldn't be so much alarmed about what is happening. And I was just listening to him, and I said to myself, well, historically, he's right, in the sense that international politics has always been power politics. But at the same time, when you experienced, there's something other than power politics, that is to say rule-based international order for the past 40, 80 years, and if there are sufficient number of countries who thought, well, it is better for their security, for their economy, then why not try to stick to it? So that's something which came up in my mind. And then the second point which came up in my mind was, well, maybe it is because of development of technology. Well, we in fact think about all those changes which is being brought to the way we fight through development of technology. And with the basic structure of international relations, whether you call it, say, international security relationship, or economic relationship, or climate change, or supply chain issues, whatever, then interdependence being so much, then it may make a lot of sense that, well, still United States may be for the time being keeping away from playing the leadership role for the rule-based international order, but it may make sense to let Americans understand why it makes better sense for the United States to come back to the leadership. And I think there are increasing number of American opinion makers. And then when I say increasing number of American makers, then there are several people who come up in my mind, like Hal Brands, or like Stephen Walt. And Stephen Walt recently wrote an article in the Foreign Affairs magazine, Elliot, I'm pretty sure you must have read it, in which he called the United States a predatory something. Hegemon, predatory hegemon, right? And well, who is Stephen Walt? He's a realist, right? And then when realist says, well, this cannot continue. United States must come back to play the leadership role. It is not John I. If John I said it, then many people would have thought that is John I. But at the same time, it is, well, Stephen Walt, the realist, who says this cannot continue, right? There is all the more reason why I think I talked about opinion makers, but at the same time, even decision makers in the United States must think seriously about United States playing this leadership role for the rule-based international order. So, Ambassador Lim, well, about, say, the kind of contribution that United States as a nation has made for the international community, I think the biggest contribution which has been made by the United States was to, in fact, make countries believe that rule of law is possible. But at the same time, now it is not interested in playing that role. But I think, again, if United States comes back to playing that role, I think it will be good for all of our countries represented here, Singapore, Poland, Australia, and Korea, but at the same time, eventually, for the United States as well. So I think I joined Korean Foreign Service back in 1978, and at the time, I just somehow, the first office I began to work at, it was the North American desk. And at the time, I was the youngest officer, and then there were older officers, more experienced officers, and then they were saying, well, for the time being, Korea-US economy, it is a single issue relationship, single issue being a security cooperation. And if it is a single issue relationship, it in fact cannot be stable. But later on, then beginning from 1980s, then economic relations began to become extremely important. And then now, there are far wider areas where we, in fact, are developing meaningful relationship with the United States: security, economy, technology, culture, people-to-people exchange, etc., etc. So, well, this is the track record. And if United States continues to play the leadership role, then I think there are, say, far wider areas of cooperation we can continue to work on in the days to come. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. When I actually, I also worked in the same division when I started out my career at the Foreign Ministry 30 years ago. And back then it was about 2 or 3 issues actually. But now really we're talking about a global strategic alliance. So I think this what we're facing now gives an opportunity for the alliance to become more global. Now, last but not least, Professor EASLEY. So you talked about middle powers working together, especially, specifically you talked about the example of Singapore, Australia, Poland, all the like-minded countries here on the panel, plus Japan. But if you can be more specific, well, what do you believe are the critical factors that make inter-regional cooperation, especially middle power cooperation, function effectively and not just show of hands and just symbolic solidarity?
It's a great question. I think the overlap in national interests, the demands of the changing geopolitical environment, the agency of leadership, these are all incredibly important. But I'd actually like to drill down on something that Ambassador An mentioned, but didn't have time to elaborate on, and that is building domestic consensus. I think all the countries mentioned have their work cut out for them, maybe especially the United States. When you look at polls, increasingly people think that their government, their economy, isn't working for them. Many citizens feel like they're being left behind, or they're getting a raw deal, or there are aspects of the system that are not fair. And at the same time, more and more national governments complain, protest, or withhold budget, or even withdraw from international organizations because they say these international organizations aren't working for me. They're not in line with my interests. Something's not fair. It's not working. I think these issues are related. So one of the most critical tasks of democratic governments in particular, but I'd go beyond that, close partners, is to speak more directly to their domestic constituents about the value of international cooperation, multilateralism, how national interests are served by international organizations, by international rules, norms, and even law. I thought that was a very poignant moment on this panel when you said the United States managed to convince other countries that international law was possible, but then the US moves away from that. But eventually, more and more Americans find that that kind of cooperation is in the US national interest. I think that domestic consensus has to be worked at very diligently. And so maybe that conversation that was really a highlight of our 3 days together with the candidates of the United Nations next Secretary General, trying to speak to the young generation, that's a big part of the equation. And it doesn't just mean having a better social media account with better AI-generated memes telling us about why we should work together at the UN. But I think it will take very sophisticated efforts to build consensus across party lines, find bipartisan points of foreign policy. And I suppose my concluding point is that Deputy Minister Lim's department deserves more budget and should hire more young people. Because we really need the public diplomacy to back up the multilateral cooperation that is demanded by shared national interests. Thank you.
Awesome presentation, awesome. I think now we can open the floor to the audience. If you can raise your hand and maybe identify yourself before posing the question, please.
My name is Jimmy Che. I'm an undergraduate student at Middlebury College, and I have a question for Professor EASLEY. You talked about the importance of Japan-Korea defense cooperation. I just want to hear your thoughts on the Chinese side of this development, where they criticize Japan's military activities as being a destabilizing factor in the region.
That's a great question coming from an undergraduate student. I think either he's going to go work at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or he might come to graduate school. So I think that the US, South Korea, and Japan have their own national interest to increase their trilateral cooperation. Japan and South Korea have their own national interest to increase their cooperation. And I don't think that the politicized, motivated criticisms of some third parties should cause governments to not act in their own national interest. Does it mean you maybe have to do some diplomacy? Yes, absolutely. But I think the THAAD dispute showed that Chinese economic coercion, diplomatic coercion, is not going to force the Republic of Korea to change policies that are in its own national interest. That being said, the way that Beijing has really dialed up the pressure on Tokyo since Prime Minister Takaichi came in to office and made certain comments relevant to Taiwan, I think causes many South Koreans to observe and say, there but for the grace of God. I don't want to go there. I don't want to experience THAAD Part 2. I don't want to be on the receiving end of this Chinese economic coercion. And I think that's very understandable. But at the same time, I don't think that that concern, and dare I say, even that mentality, should prevent South Korea from doing what it needs and wants to do in its own national interest. And domestic politics are a big deal too. I mean, President Lee said in his one-year press conference that AXA was discussed behind closed doors, but while he might think it's a good idea, domestic politics counsel caution because of the history issues, because of the complicated relationship. But I think that goes to show that public diplomacy work needs to be done. And actually, the South Korea-Japan cooperation will empower South Korea to have more leverage to deal with China, and will have more leverage to bring North Korea back to engagement. Because the more cooperation there is between South Korea and Japan, the more that Beijing and Pyongyang have to stand up, take notice, and respect the interests of the ROK.
So if I may, I just have rapid fire questions for actually all of our panelists, if I may. Ambassador, on your one of the most esteemed senior diplomats of our foreign service, and I do wish to ask you, given your comment about building on Plan A, would it not be an abdication of responsibility for your younger generation of diplomats to think not only about building out on Plan A, but also thinking about Plan B in this very uncertain world? So why would you diminish so much the utility of Plan B? That's my rapid fire question to you, sir. And to our ambassador, WISNIEWSKI, it was mentioned that Japan is noticeably absent, and you also mentioned defense awakening. How do you feel? How is Poland? I mean, are you sanguine about the defense awakening of Germany, for instance, bearing in mind the fact that by 2030, Germany's defense spending will outweigh both the combined defense spending of the UK and France combined? So how does Poland feel about that? And to our gentleman from Australia and ambassador from Singapore, norms are being broken not just by the usual suspects, but by unusual suspects in this world, the ones who actually champion the rules-based order. What would you say to those who recommend that like-minded partners like our three countries actually approach that unusual suspect together to confront them on why they're breaking those rules? And my final question, and I too will be undiplomatic as part of the audience, but what would you recommend to the Japanese? I mean, certainly it takes two to tango. And if you want to make progress and advance the cause of forging an agreement on cross-servicing and acquisitions, what would you recommend to the Japanese to make it a more conducive atmosphere for Korea to move forward on striking this agreement, knowing full well what you know about why Korea is unable to move forward on those agreements? So, thank you.
Okay, so let's just far away too from Mr. Ambassador from Singapore, and actually you can use this time to make closing remarks with your answer, because we're running out of time.
Here's a rapid-fire reply as well to your question. I think if there is a particular partner out there in the world who is not being particularly cooperative, then it is important to have dialogue with that partner. And whether that means that like-minded countries, let's say ROK, Singapore and Australia, come together to have dialogue, I think that's important. I wouldn't classify that as confrontation. I think that sets the tone a little bit differently. But dialogue is important for us to have communications and establish where our baseline understandings lie. My closing remark would basically be that earlier on there was some discussion about how we find a balance between national interest and international cooperation. I think that kind of framing puts national interest and international cooperation on the opposite ends of a scale. That's one way to look at things. But I think in our interconnected world today, sometimes it is in the national interest to have international cooperation. And maybe that kind of model is helpful for us to take going forward. Thank you.
Historically, German power meant trouble in Europe. Since 1955, however, Germany, West Germany at that time, was part of NATO. And do you know why? Because of what happened here between 1950 and 1953. Some people in the Western world back then did not want this same scenario to repeat. So Germany was divided at that time, hence to ensure non-repetition of the scenario, Germany was admitted to NATO 10 years after the end of the Second World War. Now, fast forward to 2026. Who is Poland's largest trading partner? Germany. Germany is part of NATO. Capability, I agree, is very important, but capability is nothing without intent. So I'm not so much worried about Germany building up its capability, and hopefully it can serve, and I'm pretty sure it will serve European stability, stabilizing Europe in general, but also enhancing Europe's capability to act in its neighborhood for stabilization purposes. But if I were worried about Germany, but I'm not, my worries would come from analyzing their intent. I'm not seeing any intent to deploy this military power against its neighbors, which was the case. And by the way, the German ambassador was sitting more or less on the same chair yesterday, saying that, we know. The Second World War meant that we attacked pretty much every neighbor, with the exception of Switzerland, right? So World War II began in Europe. It began with German attack against Poland. But that's history. That's water under the bridge. We are right now, we're allies, we're partners, we have guardrails. We have regulated the river, Martin. We have regulated it. We have not left too many chances for this river to overflow. And by the way, just last week, we have actually concluded a renewed treaty of good neighborly relationship with Germany. Our road, and I was in a panel this morning about V4, about our integration with European Union and NATO. Actually, 1991 was the first treaty we signed with Germany after German unification. It was about good neighborly relations, about the border and so on and so forth. I do not want to go deep into the modern European history, but Polish-German reconciliation is the backbone of the European Union today, alongside reconciliation of Germany with France and so on and so forth. The Weimar Triangle, France, Germany, and Poland working together from 1991 is really, when these three countries are working together, the EU is moving forward. There's a lot of talk about Franco-German engine. Sure, it works. But especially after 2022, defense awakening I mentioned, and the shift after 2004, the big enlargement of the EU to the east, the balance in European Union is no longer in the west, it's moving eastwards. And now, right now, we're in the middle of a discussion, when will Ukraine join the European Union and NATO? This is another story, right? So a long answer to a very short, very topical question, but again, I wouldn't be so much worried about the capabilities. If there are reasons to worry, they're mostly coming from the intersection of capabilities and intent, and I'm not saying this.
Thank you. Mr. Walker, please.
Thank you for the question, Director General Lee, and maybe I can answer it through by looking at it through the lens of the theme of this session, cooperation and competition. And I just want to briefly reframe both of those concepts in answering your question. Because cooperation, not all cooperation is created equal. Let me put it in simple terms, there's good cooperation and bad cooperation. There's cooperation that strengthens the international system based on consent, transparency, mutual benefit, respecting sovereignty and expanding choices and creating confidence that agreements are actually going to be abided by. And then there's cooperation that's cooperative in name only. I think this is where countries are pressured into agreements that they otherwise wouldn't accept. The language of cooperation can become a vehicle for coercion, right? I think we can reframe that as cooperation through compellence or through coercion. And for example, when countries are forced into entering into joint maritime development arrangements in their own exclusive economic zones under UNCLOS, or where economic tools like tariffs and export controls are used to coerce agreement on unrelated issues. This is not cooperation in the truest sense. It's leverage applied to constrain another country's choices. As Prime Minister Albanese has been very, very clear that we do not accept the tariffs that are being applied by the United States against Australia, that we expect our bilateral trade agreement to be abided by the United States, and that, in our view, tariffs do the most damage to the country that's applying them. We've been absolutely clear about that. So I think the test is this, good cooperation leaves countries more secure, more confident, and more independent. Bad cooperation leaves them more constrained, and I think that distinction is very, very important. Now, reframing competition, I'll be very brief. I think this is a thread that's really run through probably most of the sessions of the Jeju Forum. One of the risks is we think of competition as just a dynamic between two major powers, or maybe two or three major powers, and that it's a contest as to which of those powers is going to kind of come out on top. That's only one dimension of competition, and I think probably not the most important. The deeper competition is really over the kind of international environment we want to live in. Do we want to live in a region and a world where countries, large and small, are able to make their own sovereign choices, where disagreements are managed through dialogue, where institutions provide a kind of framework for cooperation? Or do we want to move towards a world and a region where power just alone determines outcomes? Coercion becomes normal, and our choices as smaller countries are increasingly constrained. I think that is a competition which all countries have a stake, all countries have agency. President Lee's slogan of pragmatic diplomacy in the national interest is great as far as it goes, as long as you define national interest in wider and in more enlightened terms. Okay, this in terms of the competition over the kind of international order that we want to live in, and it means speaking up when norms are violated, for example, as well as building stronger kind of frameworks, partnerships, and institutions. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to you, Ambassador An.
Well, Director General Lee, what I said was that we must start with Plan A and then build upon it, right? So it was a short answer. But more paraphrased answer would be this, which is that we should be building multi-layered architecture for Korea's security and economy. So one layer would be Korea-US relationship. And then that's what I meant by Plan A, and then we must stick to it. But at the same time, it in fact has to be supplemented with other layers. And then other layers would be something like, Korea trying to strengthen its relationship with other security partners or allies of the United States in Indo-Pacific, like Japan, Philippines, Australia, right? And then still another layer would be something called lattice type of cooperation. That's trilateral partnership among Korea, Japan, and United States, or IP4, that kind of lattice type of relationship. But at the same time, there could be still another layer, which would be our relationship, increasingly important relationship with NATO, for example. So in fact, we should be building upon Plan A, but at the same time begin to, in a sense, multi-layered architecture for Korea's security and economy. And that would be the more say, elaborate answer to what I meant by we must stick with Plan A. And then the reason why Plan A is important, let us just think about the North Korean nuclear issue for the time being. What are the options for us to deal with North Korean nuclear option? Can we make nuclear weapons? Maybe not in the foreseeable future, right? Would North Korea change anytime soon? I hope it does, but at the same time, I think again, not in the foreseeable future. Then what is the practical alternative we have? Plan A, right? So that I think is another reason why I was saying we cannot give up Plan A. Very briefly, to the question coming from our undergraduate student, I mean, what about the relations between Korea and Japan? And I agree with all the answers provided by Eric, but at the same time, if I could add just one point, which is opinion poll. And I agree with Eric that public opinion is important. Opinion poll in Korea, which was conducted recently, it said 75% of Korean citizens, they support trilateral partnership among Korea, United States, and Japan. And I just cited about 80% of Koreans supporting the alliance between Korea and United States. But I was even more impressed with 75% of South Korean citizens supporting trilateral partnership. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Professor EASLEY, you have the final word.
Thank you. It's an honor. When I was a speaker for a gathering of young Japanese diplomats, I was asked, Professor EASLEY, when can we stop apologizing to Korea? My one-word answer, never. I think we have to remember that reconciliation is not a box to check. It's a process that requires continuous effort and sincerity. Prime Minister Takeichi needs to be responsible. We don't want to see her go to Yasukuni. We don't want her to upgrade the so-called Takashima Day. We don't want her to associate with Japanese right-wing deniers of the history of wartime labor and the comfort women system. But despite the expectations by many that she would govern as a conservative nationalist, she's been pretty good at restraining those sort of inclinations. Now watch this space, because there's going to be very important developments about the 3 Japanese security documents and Japan's defense posture in this region and the world, and I think that will require close consultation with South Korea. But this is not the Abe cabinet. Japanese diplomats told me that in the Abe era, it was difficult for Japanese diplomats and bureaucrats to do more with South Korea because the Prime Minister's office, because testimony they had to face in the National Diet, would ask very tough questions about Korea-Japan relations. Now, Japanese diplomats and bureaucrats tell me it's much, much easier to do more with South Korea. And so my recommendation would be this. The Lee administration has been admirably pragmatic. Now I think it's time for the ROK to be even more ambitious. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think now we've reached the end of our session. Well, actually, we've exceeded our time by more than 15, 20 minutes. But thank you so much for being with us till the end. And I think we'll be ready to take off now. Actually, I have a flight to catch. Thank you. Thank you.